Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you as always for all of the support. If you are watching this as a free video, all of the content is available on Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. You can find a whole bunch of videos there, some of them available for free, some of them requiring a subscription. So thank you for considering that. As I've said from the very beginning of this war in Ukraine, there are a lot of things that can be said by a lot of different people from a lot of different perspectives. And what I try to always say openly is that my analysis is going to be as objective as possible. I don't really get down for Putin bootlicking, for Russian disinformation narratives, and I certainly don't get down for NATO cheerleading and U.S. information narratives and imperial disinformation. So I say all of that because I've gotten some feedback from people recently, depending on what the subject is that I'm talking about. They like it or they hate it. I'm either too pro Ukrainian or I'm too pro Russian or I'm anti Ukrainian or I'm anti Russian, depending on whatever the story might be. And I think that's probably good. I think that probably tells me that I'm in the right spot because if I'm pissing off everybody, then I think I probably am onto something here. So, this is, of course, the nature of our social media hellscape that we live in, where everything is divisive. Nobody has nuances. Nobody sees anything in shades of gray, and everything is either Team A or Team B. The world is more complicated than that, and that is what I try to put into these videos. Okay, so, with that, all of that said, to my friends out there who get angry and annoyed every time I say anything that casts Ukraine in any kind of a negative light or the situation in Ukraine in any kind of negative light, let me just say that some of this needs to be said because we need to be clear eyed and sober about the nature of this war. So, let's talk about a couple of pieces on the shifting nature of the war. I think it is critical that we pay attention to this because this is going to frame how we get out of all of this. How does the world avoid catastrophe? It's not going to be with flooding a war zone with more weapons or more fighters or anything like that, despite whatever morally righteous intentions we may have. So let's talk about an article that was written by, I guess, one of the preeminent sort of imperial apparatchiks in the United States. This is somebody who is very influential in liberal imperial policy circles. I mean, I say imperial because we all understand what this really is, what US and NATO imperialism represents. But to use their terminology, this is a geopolitical expert, a risk consultant, one of the preeminent experts globally, Ian Bremmer. If you don't know Ian Bremmer, let me give you like a 1 minute rundown. This is somebody who really is sort of the poster child of Obama era foreign policy thinking. He's an academic, written many books, taught at Columbia and NYU and a number of other universities. He's the founder of the Eurasia Group, one of the preeminent political risk consulting groups in the world, editor and columnist at Time, contributor Financial Times. He's come up with a number of concepts or popularized a number of concepts that have been relevant. The J curve about openness of societies. I mean, you can read all this stuff on his Wikipedia page if you would like, if you care. But I just want to give a rundown. He also popularized the idea of G0, which is basically the idea of a shift away from a G7 dominated world to a more G20 dominated world. In other words, a shift towards increased influence in China and other countries and non-Western countries. And he also, interestingly, as something I've talked about in my recent videos, he also is kind of one of the pioneers of the concept of the weaponization of finance. And I have done several videos about this. You can go back and look at the old videos there. Several videos about how the United States has waged economic war on Russia, which is another way of saying how the US has weaponized finance and used it as a tool of war making. This is something that Bremmer has written about extensively. And in fact, he's probably the single most responsible person for codifying this strategy. So anyway, I say all of that because Bremmer is somebody who, when he speaks as a sort of representative of a kind of thinking that is very, very influential in foreign policy circles at the highest levels of state in the United States. So his position, his perspective, I think, can be generalized to a major portion of the U.S. ruling class. So he wrote an article just a few days ago, "The Tide is Turning in Russia's War on Ukraine." I think you know where we're going with this, but we have to, again, be sober eyed about the nature of this war and how we could possibly get out of this. All right. So Bremer talks about Ukraine, the narrative of Ukraine as an underdog that is going to win, that this is now, that we're now headed into a new phase of this war where that narrative of the, the courageous underdog staring down the, David staring down Goliath and planning on winning, that is now, we're shifting away from that. Ukraine is now consistently losing ground on the battlefield and also in the information space. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. Russian forces are gaining ground consistently, roughly 1 kilometer per day. That may seem small, but multiply that over 20, 30 days in a month, multiply that by a couple of months, and I think we can see how far this can really go. The Russians, although they, their resources are being depleted, sanctions are hitting them hard, the economy is struggling despite what the currency is doing. That has not changed the calculus on the battlefield, at least not yet. Russian forces have seized most of the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which are the two last major cities in the Luhansk region that were under Ukrainian military control. So, for all intents and purposes, Russia basically controls Lugansk. And by controlling Lugansk, they control more or less a big chunk of the entire region of Donbas. So, while they are consolidating control of Lugansk, they are also gaining in Donetsk. They are currently threatening the cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. If they're able to take Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, or encircle them, or basically put them in a position that they have other cities in the region, then you are headed towards a sort of consolidation by Russia of control over the entirety of Donbas. Of course, they already control the city of Mariupol, as everybody knows. That already has given the Russians the land bridge to Crimea, which was one of the primary objectives that they had sought. So what we see then in Donbas is a shift on the battlefield, a decidedly more pro-Russian shift on the battlefield. I don't mean in terms of hearts and minds, of course. I mean a shift in terms of resources and territory under their control. So the Ukrainian military losses are also becoming a major problem. They are increasingly unable to replace the fighters that are either being killed or wounded, or for other reasons unable to continue fighting. And this, of course, also raises the question of war fatigue, both war fatigue inside of Ukraine, but more importantly, war fatigue in Europe. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but basically the idea that Europe's support for Ukraine is unlimited is completely ludicrous. The Europeans are not going to allow the entirety of the continent's economy to collapse under the weight of of the war in Ukraine. I hate to break this to my pro-Ukrainian viewers here, but Europe doesn't care that much. Europe can wave the Ukrainian flags, it can show its support and can show its revulsion towards Putin, but as Putin, I think, has correctly calculated, when push comes to shove and gas prices are in the stratosphere and wheat prices are in the stratosphere and people get tired of hearing about the war in Ukraine, they are going to increasingly bring a political backlash against those leaders who are ramping up the war. So we have competing forces here, and I think that we would do well to understand and appreciate just how they are sort of in conflict with each other. The European oil ban also is a big one. I just did a video about this recently. The oil ban really does, I think, reveal some of the cracks that exist in Europe. Obviously, exceptions and carve outs in the not boycott, in the ban, in the embargo for Hungary, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, three countries that are extremely dependent upon Russian oil via pipelines. Okay, so those carve-outs for oil delivered by pipeline essentially creates a carve-out for roughly 1/3 of Russia's oil exports into Europe. So what that means is, despite the loss of 2/3 of their exports of oil to Europe, on with high oil prices and other factors in play, Russia is able to weather the storm. And I think that Putin was sort of banking on Russia's ability to weather the storm. Biden, on the other hand, is in a very difficult spot now because Biden has already promised to send the $40 billion in aid to Ukraine, but he's also in a weird position where he wants to provide mid-range missiles, but not long-range missiles. I did a video on this just a few days ago, and I even got some feedback from people like, oh, well, they're just mid-range missiles. They can't reach into Russia. It's the long-range missiles that can reach into Russia. How do you know? We know what the range of these weapons are, but we don't know how they might be used, when they might be used, to what extent Zelensky himself and the chain of command is going to even control all of the weapons that flood into the space. Who might get their hands on them? There's a lot of unanswered questions about what happens to US mid-range missiles. And again, mid-range missiles become long-range missiles when you move them closer to Russia. Again, I'm not trying to be too simplistic about it. I'm merely saying that we can't be so naive as to think that just by saying, oh, well, they're mid-range missiles and not long-range missiles, therefore they can never force Russia to escalate. Bullshit. Russia can absolutely escalate when its forces are attacked directly by U.S. supplied mid-range missiles and or long-range missiles. So I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of kilometers range and all of that. All we can say is that Biden is providing some weapons, not all of the weapons that the Ukrainians are demanding. This, of course, leads, I think, probably to more questions than answers about what the ultimate implications of all of that will be. The longer the war can, let me back up for a second. I try never to, take credit for making predictions or whatever, but I know a lot of people who have reached out to me in the last couple of months that I've been doing these videos on the war and have been saying, what are you kidding? I mean, the Russians are going to collapse. The Russians are going to collapse. They're collapsing under the weight of sanctions. They're collapsing under the weight of their mismanagement. Their generals are being assassinated left and right, and on and on. And I've always maintained that the longer the war goes on, the better for Russia, despite all of the other reasons why it's a big problem for them. I've done videos about the inability to continue producing tanks, the inability to secure microprocessors, the inability to export critical commodities that would provide revenue. All of these things are true. And at the same time, Russia continues to roll on, continues to carry out this punishing, sort of grinding war against Ukraine. And it is Ukraine, not Russia, that is running out of time. It is Europe and the West, not Russia, that is running out of time. And I think that if you look at it from a military perspective, you can understand why. The Russians pulled their forces out of a lot of the other regions of the country, focused their attention on Donbas, have sort of consolidated control. And in the meantime, all of these other cracks have emerged. And so, again, the question is just how much support is there in Europe for continued war? How much support is there for them to be paying, I don't know, whatever they're paying, $10, €10 per liter of petrol in Europe? I have no clue. How much support? How many governments don't get votes of no confidence and ultimately collapse over this? I think that there's a lot of open questions about that, and I think it's very safe to assume that European governments collapse well before Putin's government does. Okay, so we see these splits among U.S. allies in Europe, and this is what I want to talk about next. I think that there's a number of different ways that we can go with this. I think that one of the things that we should always pay attention to is the nature of corporate media reporting on the war from late February through early May, maybe even mid-May. There was almost no negative reporting from the Ukrainian side. Very, very little. Yeah, there were little things here and there about the Azov battalion and, trying to kind of say, well, Putin's narratives are false, but there's also some truth to them. I mean, there was a little bit of that. But for the most part, the coverage had been more or less exclusively Ukraine is doing great. Ukraine is winning, and Ukraine needs to be supported at all costs. Russia's about to collapse. Now that we're into, past day 100 of this war, we now begin to finally get sort of cracks in that artifice of corporate media. Washington Post article headline: Ukraine suffers on battlefield while pleading for US arms. I'm not going to do a close reading of the article. I'll post a link to it and some of these other articles as well. There's some pretty good on the ground reporting, does give you some insights into some of the personal tragedies and things that are playing out on the ground in Ukraine, as they do obviously in every war. But I want to just talk about some of the international diplomacy that is pointed out in that piece and in several others. One, having to do with the leaders in Germany and France, Schultz and Macron, both of whom have suggested peace talks, both of whom want to see some form of ceasefire and some kind of a negotiated settlement. Seems eminently reasonable, of course. Kissinger, this got a lot of play. The Russians, the pro-Russian side on social media certainly amplified Kissinger, which is funny considering what an absolute demon and ghoul and degenerate Kissinger is. This is not somebody who should be seen as anything other than an absolute monster. But of course, Kissinger, when he says something that can be spun as pro-Russian, they're going to amplify that. Naturally, Kissinger suggests that the Ukrainians need to start considering negotiated settlement and ceding territory. Zelensky responded to Kissinger's suggestion by saying that he was stuck in 1938, an obvious reference to appeasement of Hitler by Chamberlain and the rest of them. This is a bit, I think, a bit inappropriate. Not inappropriate. Who cares? Kissinger's scum. But I mean to say that it's just not really correct. I mean, Zelensky can say what he needs to say. He is the leader of a country that has been invaded by a in a massive war crime, a crime of aggression, a war of aggression waged by the Russians. This is clear and obvious. Kissinger's never had any problem with war crimes. He's carried out many of his own. It's part of the reason why Putin has always respected Kissinger and looked up to him as something of a distant mentor. And Kissinger's suggestion of ceding territory, Zelensky says this is appeasement. Is it? Is it really appeasement? I mean, think through carefully what the implications are of Zelensky's position, because Zelensky has said, and I'm gonna quote it in a second here. Zelensky has already said that he refuses any plan other than a military loss for Russia on the battlefield. Okay? Now, if you are a reasonable person and you can honestly assess what's going on, think through very carefully what that means. Do you really believe Russia loses this war on the battlefield to Ukraine, even if Ukraine were to get all of the missiles that it wants from the United States, even if Ukraine were to have a no-fly zone? Which they won't get. But even if they were to have that, do you really think it would end that way? I do not. Russia has countless ways to expand the war. Russia has tremendous capabilities to not only expand the war, but amplify what it's already doing, to ratchet up the violence, to do all sorts of things. So the very idea that Zelensky says we cannot negotiate, we have to defeat Russia, he is essentially saying we cannot negotiate because this war needs to expand. I know that's a bitter pill for some to swallow, but that's just the truth. That is just the truth. So here's the quote. This is from Mikhailo Podolyak, who is an advisor to Zelensky, and he says, "quote If Russia doesn't lose, they won't have any internal transformation. A Russia that doesn't lose will, on the contrary, be more chauvinist and have an even more revanchist outlook because they will hate us for humiliating them in front of the rest of the world, and accordingly, in 2 years, they will come back and kill us even more brutally." Close quote. He has a point. He absolutely has a point because of course the I mean he's clearly he's clearly right. Russia needs fundamental transformation. If it's not already a fascist state, it is teetering on the brink of being a fascist state. It certainly is a chauvinist and imperial revanchist state, as I've said countless times before. It is a criminal gangster state, as I've said countless times before. Now we are in a situation where if they don't have a fundamental transformation of the entire state apparatus and the government, including Putin himself, there won't be any end to this conflict. That's how Ukraine sees it. I think it's debatable. I think they have a point that fundamental transformation is needed. I think that the Ukrainians are delusional if they think that they're ever going to get the support that they need to militarily defeat Russia. And they're also delusional if they think that militarily defeating Russia is even possible given the current conditions. So, again, a military defeat for Russia, I'm very skeptical of that, as I have been from the beginning. A collapse, a political change in Russia, that is much more possible. And certainly there are those folks in Washington who would love to see that. But that also is extremely worrying and dangerous because, of course, no guarantee whatsoever that Putin is replaced by somebody to his left. Absolutely possible and probable that Putin would be replaced by hardliners on his right who want all out war with the West. Okay, that's what the stakes are here, folks. I want to highlight one more article. This was from Forbes, and many articles have been written about this. It's absolutely not the only piece, but it is just one I came across. The Russia Ukraine information war has more fronts than you think. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the basic point is that Russian narratives are playing very, very well in the global South. Russia is thoroughly discredited in the West, obviously, in the United States, in Europe, and in the sort of adjuncts of the West, in Japan, and South Korea, and some other places, Australia, New Zealand. These places, of course, Russia is enemy number one, the great villain, etc. But in much of the rest of the world, Russia's narrative is actually gaining a lot of traction. This is not to say that Russia's narrative is factual or correct, but it does have elements of truth to it, and it certainly does play to some of the sympathies in the global West and conversely antipathy from the global South towards the United States and the former colonial powers of Europe. So you have 40 countries that did not support the condemnation of Russia's war in the United Nations. Of those 40, 35 of them were abstentions. I think Belarus, Eritrea, Syria, and like one or two, and two other countries, I believe, voted no on the resolution. But the abstentions can be seen as something close to a no. India, China, Iran, Pakistan, South Africa, Vietnam, South Sudan, 17 countries in Africa total. So in these parts of the world, Russia's narrative is working to some degree. The idea that the war was driven not by Russia's desire to, gain an advantage over Ukraine, Russia's desire to undermine NATO, Russia's desire to reach certain objectives, oligarch desires to enrich themselves at the expense of their Ukrainian rivals. All of the reasons that there are for this war, they all are absolutely, sort of true. But at the same time, Russia's argument that this is a defensive move against NATO's expansion, against the pulling of Ukraine into NATO's sphere of influence and all of that, that has a tremendous amount of play in a lot of the world, especially those parts of the world that have been for years, decades, maybe even centuries on the receiving end of the brutality of the European and North American powers. Okay, then places in Latin America, places in Africa, in Southeast Asia, these types of arguments do have currency there. There was an interesting analysis done by Chasm Technology, CASM Technology, which found that Russia's info narratives have been specifically targeting the countries of the BRICS and that they have been extremely effective. We've seen Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa echoing some of Russia's talking points. We've seen that We've seen it also from countries with very close ties with China. South Sudan is a perfect example. You have a country like Vietnam, which has kind of straddled this line between China and the United States for quite a long time. Vietnam abstained from that vote. So, what we see then is not that the world is united behind Russia or that the world is united against Russia, but rather divisions have been more clearly defined. And some of those divisions that already existed, they have been brought sort of front and center for everybody to see. Now, all of this said, I don't mean to suggest that I'm sort of pushing the same narrative that the Kremlin pushes, that somehow Russia can replace the West with the global South and the East. It's not possible. It doesn't work that way. Global production doesn't work that way. Supply chains don't work that way. The development of high technologies, the high value added goods, all of these other things. I mean, we understand the distribution of wealth in the world. I don't have to explain to you what the global South has to offer economically versus what the developed global North has to offer. This is what we've seen in some of those videos from Russian state media, where even pro-Putin mouthpieces have been talking about the danger of prolonging this conflict and not getting back to some kind of normalization with the West. The issue here is not about who's right and who's wrong. The issue is really about how the information war that is being fought is evolving, and how those narratives, those that sort of information warfare is going to then shape policies moving forward. It's going to shape quite a lot. The alignment of countries versus the with the United States versus alignment of countries versus Russia. Which countries are going to straddle the line between the two? There are plenty of countries in the world, like in Central Asia, for example, that have a kind of multi-vector foreign policy position where they deal with the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans and others, right? How does this evolve in the coming years, during and after this war? Presumably, this war will end at some point. A lot of questions, but it is really interesting to see the Russians have not invested their propaganda efforts in the West much at all, despite what the Putin, you know, mouthpieces on social media might have to say. They get their little Stalin profile pictures and Russia flags on their profile pictures and whatever, and they think they're little edge lords or whatever the terminology is. But the truth is that they represent nothing. They're a completely irrelevant piece of the body politic in the West. The millions upon millions of people in Africa and in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and elsewhere that do see some of this as translating to the real world, they do have some influence, and they do represent a major bloc globally. So that's something to pay attention to as well. We don't want to see Russian chauvinism countered with European chauvinism, and we definitely don't want to see Ukraine and Ukrainians as some kind of puppets of one side or another. But at the same time, we cannot be cheerleaders for expanding this war, and we cannot be cheerleaders for the road to nuclear Armageddon. Because again, I don't want to overstate the danger here. Nobody understood, or I don't want to say nobody, most people did not understand the danger in June and July of 1914. But by the fall of 1914, everybody understood. And I worry very much that there are people who might even be watching my video right now who are not necessarily thinking through that danger, and who are minimizing it because it sort of strokes their egos. Let's leave our egos aside. Let's leave everything else aside. And let's try to think about our children and our grandchildren and future generations who need to have an earth to inhabit and who need to have a civilization that hasn't been destroyed. All right, that's it for me for today. Talk to you all again next time. Thank you for the support. Patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. Really, really appreciate it. More to come.